Hey everybody, welcome to Board Online, Board Offline. Today we're bringing you Part 2B of our Gloomhaven instructional series. Now Part 2A covered the majority of the gameplay turn, okay? However, Part 2B covers the player's turn during that entire gameplay series. The player's turn is really where the majority of the complexity and everything is located, and so I pulled that out of the gameplay instructional portion and gave it its own video. I felt like it needed to be pulled out like that so we could focus specifically on it, and so that that previous video didn't end up being unreasonably long. So, like I said, we're going to get to the player turn during a gameplay round, and that's what we'll be covering today in Part 2B. Now, in the next part, we'll cover all of the concepts specific to the campaign of Gloomhaven, how to put all that together and all of that stuff. So be sure to come back for that, and be sure to check out our first video, which covered all the basics of playing Gloomhaven. Before I get down to the table, I do want to mention our sponsor, Board Game Co. This is a great website where you can buy, sell, and trade games. They have a great selection for you to choose from for buying games. They are willing to take the unwanted games off your hands and put them into their stock. You know, as long as you've been keeping good care of your game, you can probably find a way to make that happen as well. And then they have plenty of games to trade with you. They are always looking to make good trades. They will connect with your Board Game Geek account, and they'll see, hey, what is on your trade list over on Board Game Geek? What are you looking for? What are you trying to get rid of? And then what do we have that can make a match? And then they will actually build a trade list right there on their website for you to be able to make a trade happen. They have a value system that's very clear and easy to use. Be sure to go over to Board Game Co. and check that out. If you do, click on the link in the description below so they know I sent you over there. Board Game Co. makes it easy to buy, sell, and trade your way into a better collection. Now, finally, before we get on the table, I do want to mention we have a giveaway currently ongoing for a brand new copy of Unbroken. Now, this is only open to people outside of North America and Europe. For those of you who aren't aware, there has been quite a bit of drama with the Unbroken Kickstarter campaign, and pretty much everybody in North America got their copy. Some people in Europe did. A decent amount got their copy in Europe. I know there's a lot of people that haven't, but pretty much nobody outside of those two continents have gotten their copies. And so because of that, I wanted to do a giveaway for all the regions that have pretty much been left completely unfulfilled by that Kickstarter. I'm not affiliated with that Kickstarter or the company in any way, shape, or form. This is just something that I actually acquired my copy through a trade. And that was when I became aware of the Kickstarter issues. I wasn't aware at all prior to that. And I decided I wanted to do a little something just to try to help somebody out that maybe has been affected by that Kickstarter debacle. So be sure to check the link, or I'm sorry, not the link in the description. There'll actually be a link to the video right here that shows you how you can enter that contest. All right, well, without anything else, let's get down to the table. I'm going to show you how to play Gloomhaven. At the beginning of a character's turn, the player will have already chosen their 2 cards for that turn. One of those cards will have been chosen as the initiative. However, once a character's turn begins, they will no longer pay any attention to which card was the lead card, and now they will look at both cards equally. On their turn, the player will perform the top action of one of the cards and the bottom action of the other one. So if the player chooses Spare Dagger as the top action, then Sweeping Blow's bottom action will be used as well, and vice versa. When playing a card's action, the abilities of the action must be done in the order written and can't be interrupted by the action on the other card. So for instance, if the bottom action of Sweeping Blow is being used, the character must first move 3 and then push 1. Once the action of one card is completed, it is immediately placed in the appropriate area. In the case of the bottom action of Sweeping Blow, it's placed in the discard pile. If it were instead the bottom action of Warding Strength, it would initially be placed in the active section, and once Warding Strength ran its course, the lost pile. Typically speaking, players are free to choose not to perform any part of the action on their card. However, they must perform any part that will cause a negative effect on themselves or their allies. Keep in mind that the term ally includes other players and summon figures, but not the active player themselves. Abilities a character uses will never affect allies unless they specifically indicate that they do. Players can also use any card they play as attack 2 on the top or move 2 on the bottom. Using the card in this way will always result in it getting discarded regardless of what else is printed on the card. Also, at any point during a player's turn, before, during, or after performing their 2 actions, a player may use any number of items they have equipped. This is the move symbol. A move ability allows a character to move up to the indicated number of hexes on the map, in this case, 3. Figures can move through allies, but cannot move through enemies or obstacles. Traps and any other terrain effects must be resolved when the character enters that space. This is true whether the character enters that space voluntarily or by being pushed into it. However, if a character has flying, this may be adjusted. No figure may ever end its movement in the space of another figure, and figures may not move through walls. Some move abilities, such as the bottom ability for trample, are specified with this symbol as jump. Jump abilities allow the character to ignore all figures and terrain effects during their movement. However, the last hex of a jump is still considered a normal movement and so must obey the normal movement rules. Some figures, such as the Forest Imp here, have the flying trait as indicated by this symbol. This allows figures to completely ignore any figures in terrain tiles during their movement, including the last hex. However, they still must end their movement in a hex with no other figures. If a figure loses flying while occupying an obstacle hex, it takes damage as if it had sprung a damage trap and then moves immediately to the next nearest empty hex. If it loses flying while over a trap such as this, it simply springs the trap. During any part of a character's movement, if they enter a tile with a door, that closed door is immediately flipped over to the open side. This reveals the next room. The scenario book will specify any monsters, tokens, money tokens, and any other overlays that might end up in the room. Depending on the current game situation, it is possible to run out of a specific monster type and placing them on a newly revealed room. If this occurs, place as many standees as possible, starting with the ones closest to the revealing character and then moving away. Once a room is set up, any monster types that have not had an action card drawn for them this round should have one drawn at this time. Once that's done, the revealing character completes their turn. Once the revealing character's turn is fully resolved, the initiative values of all monsters in the new room are reviewed, and any that have a lower value than the revealing character must immediately act out their turn following normal initiative order. So, if this were the initiative card for the Brute, with an initiative 27, we can see that the Imp would have gone before the Brute normally. So at this point, the Imp over here would take its turn before the Archer would then take their turn with 31 initiative. In this way, all monsters always take a turn in the round they are revealed. An Attack X ability allows a character to do a base amount of damage to an enemy within their range. Attack can be either ranged or melee. Unless otherwise indicated, attacks should be considered melee. It's important to note that a figure may never attack an ally. A ranged attack will always be accompanied by a range value. This indicates that any enemy within that number of hexes can be targeted by this attack. So for the hook and chain top action, attack 3, range 3, this archer would be within range of the Brute. If a ranged attack is used to target an adjacent enemy, it gains disadvantage, which we'll discuss shortly. Melee attacks have a default range of 1 hex and therefore generally target adjacent enemies. Whether an attack is ranged or melee, it can only target an enemy within line of sight. A figure has line of sight if a line can be drawn from any corner of the attacker's hex to any corner of the defender's hex without touching any part of a wall. So obviously, for most melee attacks, this won't be an issue, even though there are some edge cases where it might be. And generally speaking, inside of a single room, it won't be an issue either, even for ranged attacks, because remember, only walls are going to block line of sight. A wall is the line edge of any tile of the map. Partial hexes found along the edge of a map tile are also considered a wall. Wall statuses can be changed by overlay tiles. For instance, this is a wall here, but if this overlay tile were here, it would now no longer be considered a wall. Once again, just to be 100% clear, because this is a commonly missed rule regarding line of sight, the only thing in Gloomhaven that blocks line of sight are walls. And also, while we're discussing line of sight, it's important to realize that line of sight is required not just for attacks, but also for ranged abilities, such as heal. However, if a non-attack ability does not specify range, then line of sight is not required at all to use it. It's also important to realize that 2 hexes separated by a wall are not considered adjacent. Now that we've covered line of sight, let's get back to attacking. When attacking, the base attack value written on the card, in this case 6, can be modified by 3 types of values in the following order. It's important to remember that these steps are repeated for each targeted enemy individually. First, an attacker's attack modifiers are applied. These may be bonuses or penalties from active ability cards such as the bottom action of Quietus, item cards such as the Eagle Eye Goggles, or other sources that players may discover throughout the campaign. After those modifiers are applied, an attack modifier card is drawn and its effect is applied. Lastly, the defender's defensive bonuses are applied. As you can see, the regular City Archer has no defensive bonuses. However, if this were an elite City Archer, it would have Shield 1. If a player has multiple modifiers within any of these 3 steps, the player determines the order in which they are applied within that particular step. Any damage dealt to a monster is tracked on the stat sleeve in the corresponding section. So you can see this is monster number 4 for the City Archers, and so the damage is tracked in slot number 4. Monsters immediately die when they reach 0 or fewer health points. So, if the regular City Archer reaches 5 damage, it is removed from the board. If that monster was not summoned or spawned, it drops 1 money token in the hex that it died in. Some attacks may have either advantage or disadvantage. If the attack has advantage, 2 modifier cards will be drawn, and the better of the 2 will be used. In this case, obviously, +2. If the attack has advantage and one of the 2 modifier cards drawn has a rolling modifier, as you see here, its effect is added to the other card played. If 2 rolling modifier cards were drawn, then continue to draw until a rolling modifier is not drawn, and then add all the drawn effects together. If the attack has disadvantage, 2 modifier cards are drawn just as before, but this time the worst one is used. In this case, rolling modifiers are disregarded entirely. If 2 rolling modifiers were drawn, then the player should keep drawing until 1 card without a rolling modifier is drawn, and they will use that card. And if a player ever felt that there was ambiguity regarding which card was better or worse, then they should simply use the one that was drawn first. Most of the time, instances of advantage or disadvantage are gained by specific character or monster abilities. However, a ranged attack, as you see here, which is targeting an adjacent enemy, as you see here, also gains disadvantage for that specific target. It's also important to note that multiple instances of disadvantage or multiple instances of advantage do not stack. However, if a player has both advantage and disadvantage, then they will cancel each other out, thereby causing the attack to be performed normally. Some attacks and abilities allow figures to target multiple hexes or multiple targets at the same time. Attacks that target multiple hexes will be indicated with an area effect diagram like this one. Any rotational orientation of this diagram is valid when targeting. The gray hex indicates where the character is. The red hexes are the targets. Also, as long as a player sees a gray hex in the diagram, then this attack will always be considered melee. It's also important to remember that there will be a separate modifier card drawn for each target. So in the case of this particular attack, 3 different modifier cards will be drawn. For a ranged area attack, only one of the red hexes needs to be within the range specified, and it does not even need to contain an enemy. And so with the Dirt Tornado, these enemies do still fall within the area of effect, since this space right here could be the target, and therefore the rest of the damage from here over would still hit them. However, it's important to remember line of sight is still important. Whether it is a melee attack or a ranged area of effect attack, any enemy not within line of sight cannot be targeted by the attack. Some attacks will target multiple enemies without an area diagram. These will be accompanied by a target X statement. In this case, target all adjacent enemies. Sometimes it may say target 2 or target 3. This means the character targets that number of different enemies within the attack's range. Also, it is not possible to target the same enemy multiple times with this attack. As usual, one attack modifier will be drawn for each individual target. Also, just to be perfectly clear, since abilities cannot target allies, any ally within the area of effect of an attack will not be targeted. If an ability is meant for an ally, it will specify effect rather than target. Attack abilities often have effects that increase their power, such as pull. If an attack effect is listed on an ability card after an attack, the target of that attack is subject to that additional effect as well once the damage from the attack has been resolved. It's very important to remember, and this is a commonly missed rule, that attack effects are applied whether or not the corresponding attack has done any damage. These effects are considered optional and can be skipped. There are certain character actions that can also apply these effects without an attack, and in such cases, the target of the effect will be written clearly on the ability card. So now, very quickly, let's go over all these different attack effects. Push forces the target to move the indicated number of hexes in a direction specified by the attacker, but each hex moved must place the target farther away from the attacker than it was previously. So in this case, push 1 could move the target there, or there, or there. However, the target could not be moved here or here, since it would still be the exact same number of hexes away from the attacker. If there happened to be no viable hex in which to push the target, then the push would simply end. A target can be pushed through its allies. However, it may not be pushed through an enemy. And so in this case, the target could go 1, 2, like that. A push is considered a movement, however, it is not affected by difficult terrain. Pull forces the target to move a number of hexes as indicated in a direction specified by the attacker, but each hex move must place the target closer to the attacker than it was previously. So in this case, with the hook and chain top action, the pull 2 could pull 1, 2. As with push, if there somehow are no viable hexes for the target to be pulled into, the pull simply ends. Also, the target can be pulled through its allies, but it cannot be pulled through an enemy. It should be noted that in this case, the target actually could not be pulled at all. Currently, it is 1, 2, 3 spaces away from the brute. If it moved here, it would still be 1, 2, 3 spaces away. If it moved here, it would still be 1, 2, 3 spaces away. And since a target must move closer with every movement during a pull, it cannot be pulled in this case. Also, just as with push, pull is considered movement but is not affected by difficult terrain. Pierce ignores up to the indicated number of points of the target's shield. So, the city archer has 1 shield. This is Pierce 2, so that entire shield can be ignored. Unlike other effects, Pierce is applied while calculating the accompanying attack damage rather than afterwards. Add target allows the attacking figure to add an additional target that is within range. Any added effects and conditions of the attack action are applied to the target as well, except for effects that would result in additional targets outside of the original added target. In other words, add targets can't ricochet off of each other, continuously multiplying each other. Certain abilities may also apply conditions to their targets. Conditions which are part of an attack are applied whether or not the attack actually does any damage, just like effects. The Bless and Curse conditions do not have tokens that correspond with those conditions. However, every other condition does. When a condition that has a token is applied to a figure, the respective token is placed on the stat sleeve of the monster that is affected. However, I often find it's easier to remember that the condition has been applied if I place the condition next to the monster's standee instead. The condition remains until the requirements to remove it are met. Also, a figure may not have multiple instances of the same condition at the same time. However, a condition can be reapplied to refresh its duration. As I go over the various conditions, keep in mind when I say a condition is removed at the end of the figure's next turn, that means the next turn after having received the condition. So if a figure receives a condition during another figure's turn, they will remove that condition on their very next turn. However, if a figure receives a condition during their own turn, it will affect them for the remainder of that turn and then the entirety of their next turn as well, at which point it would be removed. Let's go over the negative conditions first. Poison, wound, immobilize, disarm, stun, muddle, and curse. Keep in mind that if an ability applies one of these conditions, it is applied to all targets of that ability, but only after the main effect of that ability has been applied. Poison adds +1 attack to all attacks targeting the poisoned figure. So in this case, Overwhelming Assault would be attack 7. Keep in mind it does not add +1 attack to something that is not already an attack, so move 3 push 2 would still not deal any damage. If a figure who is poisoned is healed with a heal ability, the poison is removed, and then the heal has no other effect. A wounded figure suffers 1 point of damage at the start of each of its turns. If a wounded figure is healed, the wound is removed, and the heal also heals the indicated amount of damage. If a figure has both poison and wound, and then a heal effect is applied to it, both conditions would be removed. However, the damage would not be, and the heal would end. An immobilized figure cannot perform any move abilities on their turn. At the end of its next turn, the immobilized token is removed. Keep in mind that while a figure cannot move, it still can do any other ability listed on its card. On the other hand, a disarmed figure cannot perform any attack on their turn. The figure will lose the disarmed condition at the end of its next turn. A stun makes it so a figure cannot do anything other than perform a long rest. Now, obviously, monsters do not perform long rests, so in their case, they simply cannot do anything. At the end of the figure's next turn, the stun condition is removed. A stunned player character will have to make a choice. They will either have to perform a long rest or play 2 cards. If they choose to play 2 cards, these cards will simply be discarded. A muddled figure gains disadvantage on all of its attacks. Muddled is removed at the end of the next turn. If a figure is cursed, it must shuffle a curse card into its attack modifier deck. When this curse card is drawn, it is discarded rather than kept in the attack modifier deck. Keep in mind that if a curse is drawn, not only does the attack deal no damage whatsoever, but also none of the conditions are applied as well. Curse cards for player attack modifier decks have this star, and monster attack modifier decks have this M. This is important because there is a limited number of curse cards that can be doled out for monsters and players. Now let's discuss the 3 positive conditions found in the game: invisible, strengthen, and bless. If a figure is invisible, it cannot be focused on or targeted by an enemy. So in this case, the archer, who normally would focus on the brute, will instead focus on the cragheart. Keep in mind that invisible never has any effect on a figure's interactions with their allies. So for instance, it still would be possible for an ally to heal the brute even while the brute is invisible. At the end of the brute's next turn, invisible is removed. Also, monsters will treat invisible creatures exactly as if they were obstacles. This means it's possible for an invisible figure to stand in a doorway and prevent monsters in one room from finding a focus on allies in the other room. Strengthen causes the figure to gain advantage on all of its attacks. Strengthen will be removed at the end of the figure's next turn. If a figure gains Bless, this Bless card is shuffled into the attack modifier deck. Just like with the Curse card, when this Bless card is drawn, it is discarded instead of being left in the attack modifier deck. Some abilities, such as the bottom ability of Eye for an Eye, have an elemental affinity associated with them. In this case, Earth. The affinities are Dark, Earth, Fire, Light, Ice, and Wind. If any of these elemental affinity symbols are visible by itself in an action's description line, it means that by performing any part of that action, the figure must infuse the battlefield with that element. So as you can see here, Earth is by itself in this action. So if the player uses Heal 2 at all, then the battlefield must be infused with Earth. The infusion of the battlefield is represented by moving the element's token into the strong column at the end of the turn in which it was used. The way I generally help myself remember this is as soon as I use this ability, I'll move the infused element all the way off the board to the right. And then as soon as this character's turn is over, I'll look to see any infused elements and move them to the strong column. Then at the end of every round, not every turn, all elemental infusions will wane, going from strong to waning and waning to inert. Elementals always wane one step to the left, never going from strong straight to inert. Elemental infusions can be used to augment the effects of certain abilities. This augment is represented by an elemental symbol covered with a red X, as you see Earth is here. The text after the colon here is the effect that that element will give the ability. In this case, the Earth element infusion will provide +1 attack to the Dirt Tornado, also giving the Cragheart player 1 experience point. When an augmentable ability is used and the indicated element is in either the strong or the waning column, the player may augment the ability by moving the token straight to the inert column. This is the way in which an element can move from strong all the way to inert. Also, just to draw your attention to it, when a player uses an ability that infuses the battlefield, they must infuse the battlefield. However, when a player uses an ability that then uses that infused element, they may use it and are not required to do so. Some abilities may contain multiple separate augments, and the player then may choose which augments to use and in which order. Also, some augments may list multiple elements that must be used in order to get that one augment. All of those elements must be used in that case. If one is missing, the augment may not be activated. This multicolored circle represents any single one of the 6 elements. If a player plays a card that indicates the battlefield is infused and uses that symbol for the infusion, the player may choose which element to infuse. If the player plays a card that uses that multicolored wheel as indicating an element is consumed, the player chooses which element to consume. However, one multicolored wheel may not consume multiple elements. If a monster is using that multicolored wheel to either infuse or consume, the player chooses which element is infused or consumed. Also, keep in mind that since infusions occur at the end of a player's turn, it is never possible for a player to infuse the battlefield and then consume that same infusion in the same turn. However, it is entirely possible for a player to infuse the battlefield and then another player later that round to consume that infusion. When given the opportunity, a monster will always infuse the battlefield. And when given the opportunity, a monster will always consume an infused element. When a monster consumes an element, every monster of that type gains the benefit indicated. Some abilities can give a character or their allies bonuses on other abilities. These bonuses may be persistent, as this symbol indicates, or they may simply last the rest of the round, as this symbol indicates. Persistent bonuses are active from the time the card is played until the conditions specified on the card are met. Generally, the conditions involve tracking the number of times a particular event occurs, such as making an attack or defending against one. In the case of warding strength, it's on the next 6 sources of damage from attacks targeting you, gain shield 1. When the card is played, a token is placed on the card as you see here. It's placed on the first marked position of the card's action and advances 1 space each time the effect is triggered. So, the first time this player receives damage from an attack targeting them, it will move 1 space to the right. When it gets to the end, on the next attack, it would move down to here, and then so on until it reaches the end. When the ability has been used once for each space on the card is then removed from play, and as you can see, goes to the lost pile. It's important to note that the player must use the benefits of a persistent bonus when possible, even if no benefit happens to be gained. On the other hand, round abilities will last until the end of the round. After that, they will be placed in the appropriate pile, either discard or lost, depending on what the card has to say. Round bonuses, just like persistent bonuses, may be voluntarily removed from play and placed in the appropriate pile. Also, keep in mind that even though bonus cards are placed in the active area for the remainder of either the round or until their persistent condition is met, they are still considered immediately either lost or discarded as appropriate. So let's talk about the shield bonus for a second. Shield bonus abilities give the recipient a defender's bonus that reduces any incoming attack value by the indicated amount. It is possible to stack multiple shield bonuses, and they can be applied in any order as well. So, if this City Archer took a shot at the Brute, the City Archer's base attack value is 2, plus 1 from the attack modifier deck. The Warding Strength Shield 1 would take effect, reducing the total damage by 1, and so the Brute ends up taking 2 damage. Keep in mind that shield bonuses only apply to damage from attacks. Other sources of damage are completely unaffected by shields. One good example of this is damage from poison. Now let's talk about Retaliate. This bonus ability causes the recipient to inflict the indicated number of damage points on figures who attack it from an adjacent hex for each attack made. Sometimes Retaliate may be accompanied by a range value, in which case it does deal damage at that range, but by default it is a melee ability. Also, Retaliate will not resolve until after the attack that triggered it resolved. Therefore, if the retaliating figure is killed by that attack, it won't retaliate. Also, multiple Retaliate bonuses do stack. Finally, before I show you this example, it's important to remember that Retaliate is not an attack. So abilities that are triggered by attacks, such as the bottom ability of Warding Strength, will not be triggered by a Retaliate. So let's say the cultist attacks the brute with this melee attack. The attack gains 0 from here, has a base of 1. The attack modifier provides an additional 1, so 2 damage is dealt to the brute. It's not enough to kill the brute, and he has eye for an eye in play for the top ability. So this Retaliate 2 does kick in, dealing 2 damage to the cultist, and the brute gains 1 experience point. A heal ability allows a figure to return the indicated hit points to either themselves or an ally within the range indicated, depending on how it's labeled. If the heal has any range at all, then both the character performing the ability as well as any ally in range is a valid target. However, if it's listed as self, then only the figure performing the heal may be healed. When healing, simply add the indicated amount back to the figure's health points, making sure, if it's a player character, they don't go over their maximum. Some abilities summon other ally figures to the board. Summons are placed in an empty hex adjacent to the figure performing the summon. If there happen to be no available hexes somehow, then the summons ability cannot be used. Summons are represented by a colored summon token. There are 8 different color tokens, and so multiple tokens can be tracked at the same time. The tokens also have a number in them, and so you can use the corresponding small token to help track them even easier. Summons have basic statistics for hit points, attack value, move value, and range value, along with any special traits written on the ability card that summoned them. Summons are considered persistent bonuses, so the card is placed in the active area just like other bonuses, and the summons stay in play until it loses all its hit points, or its ability card is removed from the active area, or the summoner becomes exhausted, at which point the summon is removed from the board. The initiative of a summons is always considered to be immediately prior to the individual that summoned it. For this reason, a summons will never take a turn on the round it was summoned. It's important to understand that summons are not actually controlled by the summoning player at all, but instead obey the same automated rules monsters do. For these purposes, the summons is always considered to have drawn an ability card reading Move +0, Attack +0. However, when it comes time to attack, the summoned creature will use the Summoner's Attack Modifier deck. A player may have multiple summons in play at one time, and if this is the case, they will activate in the order that they were summoned. Finally, if a summons does kill an enemy, the credit for that kill goes to the summoning player. Certain abilities will allow a player to recover discarded or lost ability cards, such as the Minor Stamina Potion. When a player is allowed to recover these cards, they are looked through the indicated pile and select the indicated number of cards. For these purposes, if there was an ability card in the active area for the player, they could recover that using that same ability as well. Assuming, of course, it was considered to be in the appropriate pile. However, cards with this symbol may not be recovered or refreshed once lost, no matter what. The Loot ability allows a character to pick up every money token and treasure tile within the indicated range. In this case, this treasure tile and both money tokens can all be picked up with this single Loot ability. If this money token were here, for instance, then only this money token and the treasure tile would now be able to be picked up with this Loot ability. Loot is unaffected by the positions of monsters or obstacles, so this money token can still be looted even though it's underneath this monster. However, just like an attack, loot does still require line of sight. Any money token looted is kept in the player's personal supply and may not be shared with other players. However, if a treasure tile is looted, refer immediately to the number in the scenario book and then flip to the back of the scenario book to see what was inside the treasure chest. I'm not going to flip back there to avoid any possible spoilers. Obtaining treasure was covered in detail back in part 1 of this video series. If the looted treasure turns out to be something the player already owns, the newly looted treasure is immediately sold back to the market. We'll discuss buying and selling items more in the next video of this series. Also, regardless of any loot abilities, if a character ends their turn on top of a money token or a treasure chest, they must loot it. Summons, however, do not perform end-of-turn looting. Now let's talk a little bit about gaining experience. Some actions have experience values attached to them as indicated by this symbol here. If the character takes that action, they must gain that experience. It's important to note the ability may not be played for the experience alone. One or more of the accompanying abilities must be used in order to gain that experience, but also remember at that point, the experience becomes mandatory. For persistent bonuses, players will gain experience points as indicated when the token moves off the space with the experience points. One thing that's very different about Gloomhaven than many similar games is that killing monsters in and of itself does not provide any experience points at all. Characters only gain experience points from actions that specifically award it and completing scenarios and other very specific situations. Experience points are tracked on this dial by rotating to the appropriate number. Finally, let's talk about character damage and exhaustion. Whenever any damage is dealt to a character, the player has two possible options. They may suffer the damage and move their hit point total on the tracking wheel down appropriately, or negate the damage entirely by choosing one card to lose from their hand, moving it to the lost pile, or alternatively, choosing two cards from their discard pile to lose into the lost pile. Keep in mind, even if the option to negate all damage is chosen, the player still suffers any additional effects of the attack or conditions of the attack, such as poison. It's also important to note that if the player has not yet acted this round, the two cards chosen at the beginning of the round are still in front of them. These cards are not considered to be in their hand, nor lost, nor discarded, and so they cannot be used to negate damage. And we've previously mentioned healing during this video, but since we are talking about character damage now, I'll mention one more time that if a character is healed, simply raise the value of their health by the indicated number, making sure that it never goes above their maximum health value. There are two ways a character can become exhausted in Gloomhaven. If a character ever drops to 0 or less hit points, that character is exhausted. Or if at the beginning of a round a player cannot play two cards from their hand because they have one or no cards in their hand, and they cannot rest because they have one or no cards in their discard pile. Keep in mind that exhaustion due to insufficient cards has no actual effect on a character's hit point total. In either case, once a character is exhausted, all ability cards are placed in the character's lost pile. The character's figure is removed from the map, and the character can no longer participate in the scenario in any way. There is no coming back from being exhausted during the scenario, and if all characters are exhausted, the scenario is lost. So there you go. That's everything you need to know to play a player turn in Gloomhaven. Be sure to come back for our final part in our Gloomhaven instructional series. And that will be out probably in another 3 to 6 weeks as well. I've got other videos I'm trying to filter in between all of them. Be sure to come back and check that out. Also check out the previous Gloomhaven videos if you haven't already. And until next time, if you're bored online, bored offline.